She pointed her finger and yelled at him on live TV. She said he was being disrespectful to the law and making excuses for crime. It made the whole room go quiet. Over 57 million people watched what happened next. One person was an 81-year-old American judge who was famous for never losing an argument. The other was a 37-year-old African president who grew up in a country torn by war. But he studied law, justice, and truth. He didn't yell back. He didn't get angry. Instead, he stayed calm and quiet. Then he said something that turned the whole conversation upside down. He showed a truth that was so uncomfortable, it left the judge speechless. The video clips went viral. The news exploded. And the world started asking the same question. How did this young African president end a judge's 30-year career with just one question? What truth did Ibrahim Traoré show that made this judge cry and feel sorry in court? To understand this story, we have to go back to where it all started. It was supposed to be just another TV debate, another well-lit town hall where two famous people would share their ideas under bright studio lights. The CNN set was designed to be polite, with a nice backdrop, a professional host, and a carefully chosen audience sitting in neat rows. They were ready to clap politely and nod thoughtfully. The air was calm and scripted, camera angles were practiced, and microphones were tested perfectly. But behind all that polish, something unexpected was about to happen. Something raw and real. The two people sitting across from each other weren't just guests, they were symbols. Soon, this room would become a courtroom without walls, battlefield without bullets. First to arrive was Judge Judith Sheindlin. She was 81 years old, dressed in sharp black clothes. Her collar was stiff, and her face looked commanding. She was more than just a TV judge. For many years, she had been a pop culture icon. She was a no-nonsense leader of televised justice. When she hit her gavel, people feared it as much as they respected it. She didn't smile. She didn't need to. Just being there showed that she wouldn't put up with any nonsense. The audience, especially the older viewers, loved her. She represented order, consequences, and discipline. When the host introduced her with warm praise, she simply nodded and sat down like a queen who had sat on every judge's bench in America. Then, with much less noise, came the man who would change everything. She thought she knew. President Ibrahim Traoré. At 37, he was the leader of Burkina Faso. He didn't walk in like a president used to fancy international meetings. He entered slowly and respectfully. His presence was quiet but heavy. His eyes looked around the room, not for applause, but for meaning. He wore a simple navy suit. No flag pin, no group of followers, no arrogance. Just clarity and a silence that said, I didn't come here to perform. I came here to speak the truth. There was something about the way he stood, something unshakably strong that made the audience shift in their seats without knowing why. The host, Peter Langston, was an experienced journalist with a reputation for being fair. He welcomed both guests and explained the theme of the evening, global criminal justice reform. He called it a necessary conversation between generations and ideas, but no one knew how real that would become. The first questions were gentle, even funny. Judy made a playful joke. I've been judging longer than this young man's been alive. The crowd laughed, and even Ibrahim smiled a little. For a brief moment, the room felt warm and familiar, like any other political forum. But then Langston asked a new question, one that didn't just ask for opinions, but asked for perspective. He turned to Ibrahim and said, Mr. President, you've spoken often about unfair treatment and justice systems. How does that work globally? Ibrahim folded his hands and leaned. And slightly, his voice was low, almost like he was thinking out loud, but his words hit like heavy weights. He spoke about systems that were passed down through generations. He talked about how laws from colonial times, though repackaged, still worked to punish the poor, the black, the voiceless. He didn't mention the United States by name, but he didn't need to. Every sentence he said cut closer to home. He said, justice must be more than punishment. It must be understanding who gets punished and why. You could feel the mood change. The applause didn't come. Some heads nodded, others got stiff. A line had been drawn, not with fighting, but with clarity. That's when Judge Judy got tense in her chair. The warmth was gone from her face. Her fingers started tapping a signal that viewers of her show would recognize as a rising storm. And then she did it. She pointed at him. Her voice got loud and sharp. You have no idea what you're talking about. The words cracked through the air. I've spent over 30 years in real courtrooms, not press conferences, not stage panels. I've seen criminals of every background make choices. Good choices and bad choices. And I've held them responsible. She leaned in, her fingers still raised. Don't sit here and tell me justice is broken. I know justice. I've delivered it. The room fell silent. Energy vanished. The earlier laughter was nowhere to be found. The host froze. The camera crew stopped moving. The audience sat still, some with their mouths open, others with raised eyebrows. Even those who admired her weren't sure what they had just seen. Judge Judy hadn't just disagreed. She had accused a head of state live on television of being ignorant, and she had done it with the full force of her courtroom personality. But what she didn't know, what none of them knew, was that President Ibrahim Traoré was not about to match her anger. He wasn't going to yell. He wasn't going to argue. He was about to do something far more dangerous. He was about to make her listen. Judge Judy's words still hung in the air like smoke from a gun that had just been fired. The room stayed frozen, locked in a moment where everyone waited for an explosion. They expected President Ibrahim Traoré to defend himself, to fire back, to respond with angry words, but the explosion never came. Instead, Traoré stayed exactly where he was, sat upright, eyes unblinking, breathing steady. He didn't twitch. He didn't frown. He didn't reach for a comeback. His stillness, compared to Judy's anger, only made the tension in the room stronger. In that silence, something changed. The crowd expected a fight, but what they got was control. Complete, unsettling control. After a pause that felt like it lasted forever, Ibrahim finally leaned forward just slightly. Just enough for the microphone to pick up the soft edge of his voice. He didn't raise his tone. He didn't interrupt. Didn't strike back. Instead, he asked one simple question, delivered. With a calm that made everyone listening uncomfortable. Tell me, Judge Shinlin, in all your years on the bench, did you ever stop to ask why the same communities kept ending up in your courtroom? His voice was so measured, so precise, that people in the back row leaned forward without thinking. They didn't want to miss a word. It wasn't a challenge, not openly. It was something far more dangerous. It was a door, and she had the choice to walk through it or slam it shut. Judy didn't hesitate. She didn't ask for clarification. She didn't take a moment to think. Instead, with the authority of someone used to never being questioned, she answered flatly, because. They commit more crime. The words were cold, final, and sharpened with certainty. A few gasps could be heard from the audience, small, reflexive, barely contained. The host, Peter Langston, blinked hard, clearly unsure whether to step in, but again, Ibrahim did not react. He didn't respond with outrage. He didn't argue against what she said. He simply sat back, eyes locked on her, and said nothing at all. And somehow, that silence, that refusal to give her anger what it wanted, said more than any speech ever could. Everyone could feel it. Something had cracked. Not in Ibrahim, but in the room itself. The confidence that had wrapped around Judge Judy like a robe for decades now looked thinner, more fragile. Her words had landed, but they hadn't pierced because they were built on something that no longer held up under the weight of truth. Then, with the skill of a surgeon making the first cut, Traoré spoke again. This time slower, firmer, with a kind of quiet devastation that could only come from a man who had watched injustice up close. What if I told you, he said, that the justice system was designed to see some people as criminals before they even speak? The audience shifted. Murmurs began, not loud, but noticeable. Even Peter Langston sat straighter in his chair, his expression changing from neutral to visibly startled. It wasn't just the words themselves, but the way they landed. Without force, without rage, but with undeniable weight, Ibrahim hadn't raised his voice. He hadn't accused her of racism or bigotry or meanness. He'd simply asked the question that lived in the shadows of every courtroom she had ever ruled over. And now that question was dragging the truth into the light. It was no longer about opinions. It was about the system itself, and whether it had ever truly been blind or had just chosen to look away. For a moment, Ibrahim Traoré didn't speak. The question he had just asked, whether the system was designed to see some people as criminals before they even spoke, was still echoing in the minds of everyone there. But instead of pushing further, instead of turning this into a victory speech, he did something unexpected. He took the audience somewhere they didn't expect to go. Back in time. "When I was 8, he said softly, I watched my father get dragged out of our home by men with rifles. They didn't ask questions, didn't show a warrant. They beat him in the street because they could, because he looked like someone who didn't belong in power. He was a school teacher." The room fell into an even deeper silence. There were no camera movements, no shifting bodies, just the weight of his memory filling the space. He continued. Voice steady, but carrying something deeper now. Grief that had been sharpened into purpose. "My uncle," he said, "was taken 2 months later, accused of being against the government. No trial? No. Lawyer? No chance. We never saw him again." There were no tears in his eyes, but his tone carried the ache of someone who had buried pain so deep it had become the ground he walked on. That was my first lesson in justice. That it wasn't real for people like us. For a man sitting in a U.S. studio, halfway around the world from the dusty streets of Burkina Faso, he made that distant injustice feel close and immediate. He wasn't just telling a story, he was offering a mirror and daring the audience to look. "And that," Ibrahim said, leaning forward again, "is why I didn't study law to become a prosecutor or a judge." He paused, giving the audience time to understand. "I studied law to defend, not to punish, but to protect." His voice was stronger now, not louder, but filled with the quiet conviction of a man who had faced the machine and walked into it anyway. He described walking into courtrooms, alone with clients who didn't speak the language of the law, clients who had already been treated as guilty before they could speak. "The silence in those rooms was deafening," he said, "because no one there believed the people I defended deserved to be heard. But I stood beside them, and I listened." Then he turned to Judge Judy again, not with anger, but with something far more disarming. "Empathy, Your Honor," he said, and the words were deliberate, respectful, and charged with history. "You had the gavel. I had the people." He looked down from the bench and saw cases. I stood beside them and saw lives. There was no insult in his tone, no attack, only a simple reckoning. "You judge them. I carried their stories." And that finally broke something. Judge Judy's expression, once firm and defiant, began to shift. Her jaw loosened. Her eyes flickered downward for the briefest second. It wasn't shame, not yet. But it wasn't anger anymore either. It was something else, something much harder to live with. It was the first whisper of doubt. Of realizing that maybe, just maybe, she'd spent her career facing the law, but never truly. Seeing the people it crushed, Judge Judy leaned back in her chair. Her fingers drummed again, but this time it wasn't tension, it was strategy. She was trying to get her footing back, to take control of a conversation that had quietly slipped away from her. Her body straightened. Her chin lifted slightly. With a dismissive wave of her hand, she fired her comeback. "You and your statistics, they can be twisted in any direction to support any agenda. I don't need a spreadsheet to tell me what I've seen with my own eyes." A ripple of cautious laughter fluttered through the audience. Some chuckled reflexively, others uncertainly. Then she added with that familiar edge of sarcasm sharpened by decades of television timing. "This is what happens when the ivory tower lawyers start lecturing the rest of us. They drown in data and forget what real justice looks like." The line landed momentarily. A few audience members nodded. One older man in the front row even clapped lightly. Judy offered a brief smirk, the kind that said, "I'm still in control."
4.
A heartbeat, the room felt like hers again. Like the studio courtroom she had ruled with a gavel and a glare. But Ibrahim Traoré didn't shift. He didn't smile, he didn't flinch. He waited, letting her words settle like dust before speaking. His stillness was unsettling, and then he spoke. Measured, direct. The calm before a deliberate storm. It twisted, he began. Say that black men in America are sentenced to prison for 19% longer than white men for committing the exact same crimes. His voice was low and unwavering. The audience's chuckles died instantly. His question wasn't rhetorical, it was rooted in documented fact. And he wasn't done. Is it twisted to point out that crack cocaine used mostly in poor black communities carries sentencing guidelines that are 100 times harsher than powder cocaine? The version used mostly in wealthy white neighborhoods? There was a shift in the air, subtle but undeniable. The host, Peter Langston, blinked slowly, scanning the audience for cues. But everyone was dead silent. Traoré continued. Because these aren't opinions, Judge. They're facts. They come from the Sentencing Project, from the U.S. Department of Justice. From your own country's courts, if those numbers are uncomfortable, that's not because they're twisted. It's because they're true. Paused, not for effect, but to let the silence bloom. Judy opened her mouth almost by instinct, her body language ready to interrupt, but something in the room had changed. The audience wasn't with her anymore. They were watching Ibrahim, listening, not because he demanded it, but because he earned. It's still, she tried. Those numbers, she began, but her voice caught slightly. The confidence was thinner now. Traoré looked her in the eyes. Not with contempt, but with something even harder to look away from. Disappointment. You said justice is about behavior, he said slowly. You said it doesn't see color. But if justice is truly blind, why does it always seem to see race before? It sees evidence, that single question, delivered without sarcasm, without venom, hung in the air like smoke from a slow-burning fire. No one responded. No one moved. The weight of it was too real, too undeniable. Judge Judy didn't speak. Because she was silenced, but because she didn't have the answer. Not this time. The numbers, the patterns, the legacy of laws written with selective blindness, they were all standing in front of her now. Not in the form of charts or reports, but embodied in the calm, unwavering presence of the man sitting across from her. And that's when it became clear to everyone in the room. This wasn't a debate anymore. It was an unraveling, not of a person but of an illusion. The illusion that experience alone justifies authority. The illusion that justice has ever truly been neutral. Ibrahim Traoré hadn't come to win an argument. He came to reveal one. And now everyone watching understood the difference. Judge Judy leaned forward. Her voice was lower now, but tinged with something she rarely allowed to surface on live television, frustration edged with vulnerability. She had lost the rhythm of the conversation. Her instincts, honed by decades of televised courtroom combat, told her that the only way to recover was to use experience as dominance. You're young, she said. The words were intended to cut, to reframe the balance of power. You haven't seen enough yet. Real justice, it's not theory. It's not idealism. It's lived. It's earned through years of seeing what people really do when no one's watching. Her words were sharp, but her voice betrayed the strain. She was reaching for something solid, a position of superiority. Well, it was slipping. The silence that followed wasn't supportive. It wasn't affirming. It was hollow. The audience didn't shift toward her. No one clapped. No one smiled, because everyone could feel it. The tide had turned. Ibrahim Traoré remained seated for a moment. His eyes were calm but unblinking. Then, without a single word, he pushed his chair back and rose. The movement was unhurried, deliberate, almost respectful. He didn't raise his voice or slam his fist or glare with anger. Instead, he stood like a man who had been carrying a weight for too long. And now, finally, it was time to place it down. The lights caught him just right. Not dramatically, but clearly. He wasn't trying to perform. He was about to tell the truth. And everyone in the room, from the host to the furthest audience member, leaned in. It was instinctual. Something in the air had changed. I've seen enough, he said. His voice was smooth but firm. I've seen enough to know that justice, as you've defined it, doesn't fall equally on all shoulders. His gaze held hers. It's not with aggression, but with unshakable truth. I've seen prison cells packed with black boys, some of them barely teenagers, sent away for crimes that wouldn't earn a warning in another neighborhood. I've seen courtrooms where the accused couldn't afford a lawyer, where a 5-minute hearing decided the next 15 years of their life. His words were clean and measured. Not dramatic, not theatrical, just precise. I've seen mothers who cry not just because their sons were convicted, but because they never expected anything different. Because the system told them long ago they weren't meant to win. There was a beat, a moment suspended in time, before he added even more quietly. And I've seen people like you. The words landed softly but carried the weight of 100 verdicts. Shh. People who made careers, built legacies, earned millions. Well, calling this imbalance the law, you didn't fix the system. You became its face. You profited off the illusion that punishment equals justice. The last line lingered like smoke. Not shouted, not spit, but spoken with a gravity that felt biblical. You could feel the audience stiffen. Some looked at Judy. Others kept their eyes on Traoré, as if watching history rise in real time. Judge Judy's body didn't move, but her eyes flickered. For a split second, something cracked, not outwardly, but beneath the surface. Her jaw, which had been set so tightly, all evening loosened. Her shoulders, always squared, dipped slightly. She opened her mouth as if to respond, but no sound came out, not even a breath. She blinked once, then again. And slowly, almost imperceptibly, her eyes began to fill. It wasn't showy, it wasn't dramatic, it was human. This wasn't the fury she was known for. This wasn't humiliation or anger. It was something far rarer for her. Recognition. And maybe, just maybe, regret. In all her years of courtrooms, on camera and off. She had never been left without a final word. Her brand was authority. Her armor was control. But now she stood metaphorically and emotionally, naked in front of a truth she couldn't reduce, redirect, or dismiss. There was no clever quip, no cutting comeback, only silence. Not from weakness, but from the realization that she had been met by someone who didn't need to outshout her, someone who had lived through what she had only judged from above. The audience didn't clap. They didn't shift in their seats. They just watched, stilled by a moment that demanded respect, not reaction. The cameras panned slowly between them. A woman who once symbolized televised justice, and the man who had just redefined what justice really meant. And in that silence, with the world watching, Judge Judy Shinlin, the woman who had built an empire on always having the last word, quietly, completely, and irreversibly lost it. When the cameras cut to commercial and the studio lights dimmed, the panelists were ushered off stage like any other post-debate moment. But in the control room, in the production booths, and especially online, something very different was happening. Editors scrambled to grab the clip. Assistants were already uploading key moments to social media, and viewers still stunned by what they had witnessed. Did what people do in the digital age when they see truth land like lightning? They hit record, clipped it, and shared it again, and again and again, within the first hour. A 48-second video of Ibrahim Traoré calmly asking Judge Judy, if justice is blind, why does it always seem to see race before evidence? Had already been posted to Twitter, TikTok, and YouTube Shorts. It exploded. It didn't just trend, it ignited. 57 million views followed within 24 hours. Not just because it was dramatic, but because it was undeniable, because it was real. The internet, which had watched Judge Judy for decades, shut down defendants, lawyers, and court spectators with one-liners and raised eyebrows now watched her sit in silence. Not because she'd been insulted, but because she'd been proven wrong. People weren't just replaying it. They were analyzing it, quoting it, remixing it. TikTok creators layered cinematic music beneath Traoré's voice and slowed the footage to emphasize the moment Judy's face changed. When her jaw slackened, her eyes lost focus, and her gavel might as well have turned to dust. One viral post showed the clip alongside a caption, "When truth walks in, ego walks out." Another dubbed the moment the softest knockout in history. Twitter, the hashtag silenced by Traore, trended globally within hours. The man who silenced Judge Judy had become not just a catchphrase, but a cultural turning point. Reaction videos flooded YouTube, not just from influencers and political commentators, but from teachers, lawyers, and even retired judges. One video, which hit 2 million views in a day, showed a group of law students at NYU watching the clip and pausing every few lines to break down Traoré's rhetorical strategy like it was a masterclass. At Stanford, a constitutional law professor called it the most composed and ethically devastating takedown I've seen in 2 decades of debate analysis. In high schools across the US, civics teachers began incorporating the clip into lesson plans about power, speech, and justice. Even children as young as 14 were writing reflections on what it meant to hold someone accountable with facts instead of fury. At Howard University, students held an impromptu campus screening of the full exchange, followed by an open mic night, where students shared their own stories of being silenced and what it meant to finally be heard, and then came the voices that made the moment historic. Legendary scholar and activist Angela Davis, in a radio interview with NPR, said, "What Ibrahim Traoré did wasn't just about the data. It was about dignity." He reminded the world that justice isn't loud, it's grounded, it's deliberate. It's what happens when someone refuses to be intimidated by legacy and instead speaks from lived experience. Her words were echoed in think pieces from The Atlantic, Al Jazeera, The Guardian, and even Forbes, all of which praised not just the content of Traoré's message, but the method.com/controlled, evidence-based. Now, the opposite of today's screaming match politics, Politico ran the headline. "When silence wins, how Traoré beat an American icon without raising his voice." Major news anchors reacted with rare reverence. Anderson Cooper, who hadn't even been the host of that particular panel, opened his evening segment with the words, "Something changed last night." On MSNBC, Rachel Maddow said, "In an age where everyone's yelling," he whispered, "and that's why we heard him." Even Fox News, which initially tried to spin the moment as disrespect to American institutions, found themselves walking back critiques as polls showed massive bipartisan admiration for Traoré's composure. One commentator begrudgingly admitted, "Whether you agree with his views or not, you can't deny that he did something remarkable. He made one of the toughest women in media history stop and rethink her words, and he did it without blinking." The international ripple was even bigger. Across Africa, news stations played the clip in full. Not just the viral line, but the build-up, the questions, the emotional shifts in Ouagadougou. Traoré's hometown, citizens gathered in cafes and open squares, watching the replay on loop with tears in their eyes. Street murals began appearing. Not of Traoré shouting or pointing, but of him sitting with his hands folded, head tilted slightly, eyes steady. Underneath the image, the words read, in French, "He didn't shout, he simply told the truth." Political leaders from across the continent tweeted in support. In South Africa, a member of parliament called it a cultural victory against the myth of Western legal neutrality. In Kenya, students at the University of Nairobi held a forum titled, "When the Gavel Fails, a New Language for Justice." Even in Europe, where Judge Judy's television presence was less iconic, the moment resonated deeply. French newspapers framed it as a reckoning between colonial frameworks and post-colonial clarity. German television called it a moral checkmate. Across the world, the moment transcended the individuals involved. It became about something bigger. It was about generational power, racial inequality, and the courage it takes to confront revered systems with inconvenient truths. Ibrahim Traoré had not come to America to go viral. He had come to speak plainly, calmly, and clearly. And in doing so, he delivered a kind of truth that no camera could contain. In an age addicted to outrage, he offered stillness. In a room built for performance, he chose presence. And while Judge Judy had spent a lifetime commanding silence with her gavel, it was Traoré's truth, soft, devastating. and undeniable that finally taught the world the power of it. There were no fireworks, no outbursts, no camera angles that had to pan away from chaos. Just one man, one voice, in a moment of truth so powerful it didn't need to be shouted to. Be heard. Ibrahim Traoré didn't raise his tone. He didn't roll his eyes. He didn't humiliate with jokes or resort to mockery. He simply told the truth, with calm, with clarity, and with compassion. And that was enough. It was more than enough. In a world so often drowned in noise, in performance, in sound bites, designed to provoke rather than enlighten, this one moment reminded us of something rare, that the greatest strength doesn't come from volume, but from conviction. From standing in your truth and refusing to be moved. And now the question turns to us. Have you ever stayed silent? Not because you were wrong, but because you thought no one would listen? Have you ever walked into a room where your story didn't seem to matter? Where you felt the weight of someone's title, age, wealth, or reputation pressing down on your voice? What if your truth, spoken not in anger, but in quiet certainty, was the one thing that could shift the room? Would you speak, or would you stay silent one more time and watch the world carry on unchanged? Traoré's story isn't just about politics. It isn't just about race or generations or reform. It's about courage. The kind that doesn't wear medals or demand applause. The kind that sits calmly in front of legacy, tradition, and arrogance and refuses to look away. Because in the end, this story wasn't about a judge. It wasn't even about a president. It was about a reckoning. For decades, Judge Judy symbolized justice in the public eye. She was the gavel, the authority, the voice that cut through excuses. She became a pop icon by portraying certainty, by never blinking, never backing down. But now the world has seen something else, something deeper. A quiet man from West Africa, raised not in the courtrooms of television but in the realities of injustice, who walked into her world with no script, no defense, and no desire to win a headline. And yet he rewrote the rules. He didn't beat her. He didn't shame her. He just stood in truth and made the world see that justice doesn't belong to the loudest voice, belongs to the clearest one. And in that moment, a legacy was reversed. Because now, when people speak of power, of grace, of what it means to hold someone accountable without ever raising your voice, they won't think of the woman behind the bench. They'll think of the man who stood in front of it and simply told the truth. The character Ibrahim Traoré and all individuals depicted in this story are entirely fictional. Any resemblance to real persons, living or dead, is purely coincidental. This story is a work of creative expression and does not reflect actual events or real-life individuals. If this moved you, challenged you, or made you think, please consider subscribing to my channel so I can continue bringing you more powerful and meaningful stories. Your support helps keep these voices alive. Thank you for watching.